Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to a special episode. We're not doing a particular year this year. We're actually doing an interview with one of the artists that I've highlighted on a previous episode. Isn't that amazing? I actually had the opportunity to connect with Richard Barone from the Bongos, who we highlighted in our episode 1982 when I reviewed Drums Along the Hudson. So we actually had an opportunity to sit down and talk with each other about Drums Along the Hudson, how it came to be, the journey that he and the Bongos have gone on since then, and what he's up to right now. So without further ado, let's get to the interview itself. Thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time today to have a conversation with me and sit down. As part of the Not Scary, Just Music podcast, I
Great.
talked about the Bongos and Drums Along the Hudson and how excellent of an album it was. It was on my
Thank you.
essential albums for 1982.
Thank you.
And so before we get into talking about Drums Along the Hudson, which I'm very excited to talk about today,
Mhm.
one of the things I wanted to start off with was just kind of getting to know you as an artist a little bit better and kind of what inevitably led you to getting into the Bongos and, then everything thereafter.
Sure.
So the first question that I had for you is, how did you get into music originally? I presume like when you were a kid, like what were you listening to? And
Yeah, well, what I was listening to, what was on the radio at the time, but that led me to being a commercial radio DJ on a top 40 radio station at age 7. So I had an unusual beginning because I had exposure to all releases of all labels and all records at that time, because I would be sent records on Monday or Tuesday of the week, and I'd go through records and decide what to play on my Sunday radio show, which was called Beach Party. It was live from the Municipal Beach in Tampa, Florida, and I was the littlest DJ. It was really fun because I got to learn really about a lot of the artists that I later worked with. For instance, Donovan is an artist who became a mentor to me. And for the last 20 years, I've performed and worked with Donovan in many different ways on recordings and live concerts. As a child, I was very attracted to his music, which was kind of folk, rock, jazz. What he was doing was mixing genres. And that's really what I was interested in then, and I'm still interested in now. And what Drums Along the Hudson really tapped into was this idea that it isn't just one thing. It's a mixture of musics. We listen to jazz, that's why there's these explosions of saxophones. We listen to avant-garde music. We listen to Sun Ra. We also listen to we love the early Beatles. I think some of the benchmarks of the Drums Along the Hudson are Buddy Holly, the Beatles, but then also the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed, avant-garde scene of the late 60s, et cetera, and 70s. And really, we love Brian Eno and David Bowie. So there's a lot of experimentation within the rhythms of rock and roll within Buddy Holly. And we love dance music too. So there's sometimes that. The Bongos never wanted to be classified as one thing. We really liked our music being malleable and flexible and being able to play instinctively. And that's what Drums on the Hudson especially highlights, all of that, because we produced it ourselves with the record label. Did not guide us. They were not interested in telling us what to do. So that's the most pure example of what the group, the Bongos, is displayed on Drums Along the Hudson.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure if you listened to the snippet in the episode that talked about the Bongos. What I had said is that there was certainly post-punk elements of the time that were in there, but one of the things that I called out specifically was that you all were using retro rock and roll elements in order to soften its tone and make it more consumable for the masses.
Yeah, that wasn't really what we had in mind. We were quite happy just doing music for ourselves. The Bongos, and coming from Hoboken, New Jersey, which is a little town right across the river. I live in the West Village of Manhattan now, but Hoboken was then a very small little town that was like an artist community in a way. And it was all about being yourself. And everything about Hoboken was the venue that we helped start was called Maxwell's. And that was our neighborhood venue. Our drummer was the cook there. And Rob, the bass player of the Bongos, also was the sound man. It's because that was our home. That was our rehearsal place. That was not a venue until we started playing there. We were the first band to play there. We had that nurturing sense of community that we had at Maxwell's, and with our audience there, we were able to do what we wanted to do musically.
So was that the impetus for kicking it over officially to turning into an official band, trying to put together songs and tracks? How did that come about?
So originally, I had just moved up here from Florida
Mhm.
through meeting a band that was from New York that was traveling through Florida, and I kind of hitched a ride back up here with them. Roughly, that's just sort of in a nutshell. It's in my book Frontman more specifically, but roughly
Right.
that's what it is. And once I was here, I got some acting work, but I really wanted to be in a band and working with the band. I really was a musician, and I wanted to continue that. So I answered an ad in what was then the Village Voice. It no longer exists as a physical newspaper, but the Village
Right.
Voice was a cool paper. In the back were classified ads of musicians looking for bandmates, etc. And there was an ad that said looking for a guitarist, singer who is into the current bands of that time, the Ramones or whatever, Talking Heads, Velvet Underground was
Yep.
mentioned. I think Beatles might have been mentioned. If it's, and I'm like, well, that sounds like me, you know. And so I answered it. It just happened to be 2 or 3 of the guys that was going to become the Bongos later. We're kids, by the way, at this age. We're not yet 20 years old. It was Glenn Morrow, who then later started the record label Bar None Records and had a group called the Individuals. There was a group forming that we eventually named A, the letter A, small
Mhm.
lowercase a. In that group, I was playing guitar and singing, but not always as the front person, because Glenn Morrow shared those duties with me, and Glenn Morrow did quite a lot of it. But it morphed as bands do, and it changed, and the gravitation went more in the direction of my songs, which were 2 minutes long, and they were short. There was something going on with that stylization that
Yeah.
the other guys, that Rob and Frank, who were the bass player and the drummer,
Mhm.
really liked, and they wanted to continue the group differently than we had originally planned. So it became a trio with just us 3. And
Hmm.
Glenn Morrow went on to create his group called the Individuals, and also found the record label Bar None Records. And he was also a journalist for the New York Rocker. Glenn Morrow was quite an entrepreneur and very smart person, and he had several different things going on. So the Bongos comfortably went off and became a trio, just the 3 of us, coming out of the Group A. Group A had much more complex songs. They're very influenced by the group Television and maybe some of the rhythms of Talking Heads, but with sometimes grander landscapes that almost echoed Bruce Springsteen. And it was
Yep.
very different from what the Bongos were doing, which was a much compact sound. And the trio was able to get that sound really well with just the 3 of us. So we
Hmm.
started forming, and it clicked. People liked us. I think a lot of it was to do with the live stage performance, which was extremely high energy and could be compared to the punk rock bands at that time. Even if we were
Right.
melodic, we were very melodic, but it had the energy of punk rock. And I think somehow we were able to get some great gigs. And soon we were playing in London at the Rainbow Theatre. We had not quite yet, or maybe just got signed to a British label called Fetish Records. And it's through that signing that Drums Along the Hudson got made, because all the Drums Along the Hudson is, even though it does hold together very well as an album, I believe, it was all singles that came out in the UK.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was all singles and EPs, which was interesting. And I knew it would fit together because it came from one mindset. It came from one stream of consciousness, writing and performing. So it had a cohesion because of the way it was made, but they were all singles in England. We really wanted to only do singles. In the US, when we came back here, the record label that wanted to sign us, it was PVC Records. Passport Records was the parent label, I believe. They insisted on a 12-inch vinyl album with a certain number of songs on it. They wanted an LP. So
Mhm.
we very carefully sequenced Drums Along the Hudson out of the singles.
Interesting. And I called out specific tracks in it. I didn't actually call out Bulrushes in the episode itself, but in the Congo, obviously one of the big hits, Video Eyes
Yeah,
and then Glow in the Dark. All
yeah,
3 of those to me had a wide variety of, as you said, there's punk energy to it, but there's
yeah,
also rock and roll energy to it. And it
yeah.
to me, it was such a great bridge between those 2 universes. Because the thing is, at least by my perception, there was things that were happening around that era where a lot of people were playing with trying to integrate more rock and roll concepts.
Yeah.
But it sounds like for your case, you were just kind of open to the universe, and that's just kind of what happened, which
We
is
really
great.
were. We really were very open to the university. We had no plan, no grand 5-year plan. A lot of the groups, you know, at the time had these blueprints of what they wanted to do, but the Bongos
Yeah.
really just wanted to make music and play from our hearts and play
Hmm.
for people. And we played a lot of shows. I mean, when we were on tour a lot, we would do 300 shows a year easily. And we just,
Wow.
you know, we played almost every night,
Wow.
and we loved it. We loved the performance. A lot of it is designed to be performed live.
That's amazing. I hear what you're saying about the blueprint piece. I think you talked about Talking Heads for a second, right? I
Mhm.
think there was always a blueprint
Oh
there with
yeah, yeah.
what they wanted to do, and they
I love
set
them,
out
by
to
the way.
do it.
I
Oh, I
really
know.
love
Me
them,
too.
and
Me too.
I've worked with them, and they were also very helpful with us when we started. We had no equipment, we had no place to
Oh, wow.
rehearse. As we got into bigger venues, we needed more space to work and to plan. And the Talking Heads were very generous with us and gave us a place to rehearse. And also, we used some of their crew members. And later, we toured with Steve Scales on percussion, who had just done the Stop Making Sense tour with the Talking Heads.
Yeah.
So we owe them a debt. So many people helped us. We were the young kids on the block, and even Peter Frampton came up to the plate.
Wow.
When we got our first tour, I believe our first American tour, we had no road cases, for instance, to travel with. So we had all our stuff was just like, how do we move this? And Peter Frampton very generously offered all of his road cases. So on our first tour, which was with the B-52s, it was a double bill with the B-52s, all of our road cases said Frampton comes alive on the side of the cases. So people thought, well, I don't know what they thought, but they saw Frampton's cases arrive. But it was for the Bongos because he was generous enough to loan that to us. All of those,
Wow, that's tremendous. So is that after Drums Along the Hudson
It
had
was
come
during,
out?
it was just
Oh,
after, like, so that was the
mhm.
Drums Along the Hudson tour, which was a big tour for us because I think we did at least 30 shows with the B-52s, then went off on our own. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of offers along the way, which was interesting. We would get halfway done with the stream of shows, and then we'd get an offer to do another bunch of shows. So we just stayed on the road when Drums Along the Hudson came out. Then we got signed to RCA while on that tour. So between Drums on the Hudson and then the first RCA album, we were on the road the whole time.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, to have that kind of momentum,
We had a
is
great
tremendous.
momentum. Yeah. And it doesn't happen the same way now. I have my students at the new school or even at NYU where I was before, they're performance students, and they're facing a different type of music industry than I faced.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
we were in this world where college radio was a strong driving force. And the power of college radio and MTV together gave us familiarity throughout the country, US especially, but other countries as well. But in the US, very strong radio support at college radio and MTV support. And so we were known by those media already. So we were getting offers to play everywhere.
That actually seems like it's a more modern thing where you go from being not really well
Yeah.
known to all of a sudden you're in it, right? Because these days,
We went
being that,
viral. Yeah.
yeah, right, that you could just post totally uncooked ideas on social media. And so you don't have to go through a route of the underground in order to
That's
really
true.
find your sound. And so there's a lot more uncooked ideas that are just getting thrown out onto social media and into the sort of listener space.
Yeah,
So
the era that we're talking about was the precursor to what we have now, because it's a bit of a DIY attitude where you do it yourself, you do your own podcast or your own social media, etc. It's very similar. We didn't have the internet, so we had to use things like printing machines and making Xeroxes and mailing things out. But it was the same basic idea of doing it yourself and being in control. And when we first started out, the labels were very happy to let us do it ourselves. The owner of Fetish Records was only 21 years old himself. He was very happy to let us run the US division of Fetish Records. So we were one of the few American groups that were signed to his label. We learned a lot by doing that. And all of the Drums Along the Hudson material was licensed to Passport, not sold. So we own that album. And it's been on many different labels since the version that originally came out. It's been on at least 5 or 6 different labels because we licensed it for periods of time of a few years. The ownership of Drums Along the Hudson was gifted to us by the owner of Fetish Records.
that was very kind.
Very kind. He really liked it. He was starting to ease out. He had his fun as being the president of a record label, and then he wanted to kind of do other things. And as a parting gift, he gave us the rights to Drums Along the Hudson.
Considering the state of things as they can
Yeah.
be, that was unusually kind.
So that was always great, but it was always, he knew that was always our baby, that we made it and we did that ourselves. So he was generous to give that to us.
So I presume that while you were going on tour, there were reviews that were getting written about the album, and I'm sure that people were coming up to you and having impressions of them. So what is it that you saw in these songs or on this album that perhaps critics missed or misinterpreted, or people that were listening might not have picked up on, that you wish that more people had known about it at the time?
Making the album was spontaneous. And I think that spontaneity comes through in the performance and also in the lyric writing. It's sometimes mysterious poetry. Other times it's not quite so mysterious, but it's always spontaneous. And it's never overly wrought or overly thought. It is in its moment. It's in the moment. And it still sounds fresh to me because of that. We didn't labor over any of it. Sometimes we'd have to figure out how a guitar figure could work, but we got it pretty quickly and it worked and we went with it. The whole idea was that it should sound almost live and organic, and it just created itself. So we let our influences, whatever music we loved, kind of come through. You know, like I said, we love the early Beatles and the way they played, like when you hear on bootleg recordings, especially them at the Cavern Club or in their early Hamburg days. We really loved that primitive rock and roll quality that they had. And we really tried to capture that. And making Drums Along the Hudson was almost all done in England, by the way. I just wanted to add that, on a sheep farm. The recording studio was on a sheep farm. There were sheep looking into the windows while we were playing and playing the drums. And it was so interesting that it was my first time in England. And it was a beautiful setting and a very green farm, and there was a recording studio. It was owned by this gentleman named John Fox from the group Ultravox.
Oh, wow.
This was his studio. It was called Jacob's Studio, named after the type of sheep that were bred there. And it was a beautiful experience because, unlike the American studios that we soon found ourselves recording in, it was a residential studio where you lived there, and they had staff members to cook for you and tend for you as you worked on your album. So we would work at any hour of the day or night and have dinner and make more music. And it was very beautiful.
That's amazing. I would not have pictured in my mind that setting,
Yeah,
but
I know.
now I'm
Me
going
neither.
to.
I wouldn't have either when I heard the album, but it was a lovely time to record there in a beautiful studio, and an excellent engineer, Ken Thomas, who had worked with Elton John and so many greats as a young assistant engineer, and was sort of graduating to becoming the chief engineer at that time. And he had just done an album for the group Wire that we liked. We loved him and we loved working with him, and he was so polite in the studio, and it made us feel great to record there. It's a great sounding record. I think that his engineering is brilliant.
It sounds like the vibe that you were shooting for. It sounds like you were in the bar playing the music,
Yes.
but you just took out all the crowd sounds, and it sounds totally organic.
It does. It felt like we were performing in a club, and we kept it that way. And we also used almost all first and second takes of the song. We didn't do it over and over because we did the whole thing in a weekend or so, mostly. I mean, some songs had already been recorded and released, but everything we recorded new at that studio, we just plowed through them as if we were doing a show, one after another. And I think I did all the vocals maybe in one night, things like that. We did it quickly.
So just in the immediate aftermath, so right after the tour and everything, so where did this album carry you? So it obviously carried you to your first RCA album.
Yeah.
But how did it launch you beyond what we've talked about already?
It really launched us, because just putting out a few singles was great, and it was really fun, and we could be flavor of the week in the different magazines at the time. But then putting an LP of 15 songs out, and then having one of them be on the Billboard charts, Mambo Sun, the T-Rex cover song on there, was on the Billboard charts. We were seen as more of a serious entity. I think the liner notes sort of set us in a nice way on the back cover. There were liner notes by Richard Grable, who was a writer for many different newspapers and magazines at the time, and explained what we were doing. And I think it definitely gave us many more options as far as our live performing, and did lead to our signing to RCA, because we had proven that we could do it on ourselves first through Drums Along the Hudson. So, and that still is something that labels look for, maybe more now than ever. They look for acts who can do it on their own. Not just because it's less work for them, but because if you can make it on your own, then that gives you that extra punch that you don't have to depend on a label to do it for you.
Right.
So we felt very pleased with that album, and we continued touring. We had toured in Europe, and then we continued touring here. We played a lot of shows, as I said, around the time of Drums Along the Hudson, and we continued to for the next 5 years or so. We kept touring solidly through 1987, I believe.
My goodness. That must have been exhausting by the time it was over.
Yeah, we started in 1980. That's when the band started, and we performed then. Of course, we did all those singles for Fetish Records, and then the album 82. That's already 2 years solid of touring, but then we did 5 more years on the road solid. It was fun though.
I'm sure. I am absolutely sure of that.
When the Bongos decided to, we didn't really break up. We still do shows, and we just played Lincoln Center, I think, last year, and Carnegie Hall in November. We perform when it's possible to do so. It's not always possible because we live in different places and do different things. We never broke up really. But when we started doing separate work, let's say in 87, I put out a solo album called Cool Blue Halo. And it was very different from the Bongos in that it was more acoustic based and used cello and symphonic percussion. So there was no rock band on that album. It was a live album recorded in New York at a club called The Bottom Line, which no longer exists, but was a great place. And that record was, to me, as an artist, as a solo artist, especially now at this point, it was like a second Drums Along the Hudson. It was created with the same kind of spontaneity. It was recorded live, this time with an audience. And I tried to carefully pick 3 cover songs that meant a lot to me. I picked a Beatles song, a Mark Bolan T-Rex song, and a David Bowie song. And those were like the pillars that held up the project.
Hmm.
And then I began it and ended it with the Bongos song. And then I wrote new material in between. And that album did well for me. And similarly to what happened with Drums Along the Hudson, I was offered a tour, this time with Suzanne Vega. She had just had a hit with the song Luca. And we did a tour of theaters, very similar to how Drums Along the Hudson, how I started. I was her support act. And it was a great exposure for me. And through that tour, I got signed to Universal Records, Universal Music. Because that was just like Drums Along the Hudson, that Kublu Halo came out on the Passport label.
And I can see how all you have to say is, I was touring around with Suzanne Vega when she did Luca, that I could envision where your creativity was going if that's how you were kind of syncing up at that moment. So that makes sense.
Yes, yes. And I was finding my place as a Greenwich Village musician also because I had been living in Hoboken. But then I moved here in the mid 80s. And I really wanted to understand and feel what it's like to be a musician in Greenwich Village because I had read the history of it and it has such a long legacy of music. That's what that album was kind of about. It was like discovering my Greenwich Village self. Out the door is Waverly Place. And a few blocks from here is MacDougall Street, where all the clubs were in the 60s. And that's what I teach at the New School. I teach music and revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s. I wasn't there. I was barely born, but there was a music scene that was so powerful here.
Hmm.
So Kublu Halo started me understanding that. So I got signed to Universal and did several records with them. I did two albums for them. But I also started producing other artists, which I love to do. And I started producing concerts, big concerts, including my first one was a large-scale tribute to Peggy Lee, who I always admired at Carnegie Hall. That was my first big Carnegie Hall show.
Oh,
Since
wow.
then, I've done Carnegie Hall 4 times. I did the Hollywood Bowl with the Peggy Lee tribute. I learned to produce big concerts. I love it. I love producing. I've got my next show on November 18th. I'm producing a tribute to George Takei, Mr. Sulu from Star Trek, who's an activist and a very important activist and has a great story. And we're honoring him by the Mazzoni Center is the LGBTQ plus community center in Philadelphia. It's going to benefit them. It's a gala for them, but it's held at the Kimmel Center of the Performing Arts in Philadelphia on November 18th. Very excited about that. I'm actually also performing in that show. That's going to be a great show, and listeners can find mazzonicenter.org for tickets. But I love producing concerts. I just did one of tribute to Mark Bolan and T-Rex 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles, and did the Music and Revolution book as my textbook for my class. We did it as a performance at Carnegie Hall in November of last year, and I love doing big shows. So I do a lot of concert production. And I've done several records. I did a tribute to Greenwich Village in 2016 called Sorrows and Promises. It's all music from that era. I didn't write anything on that album. I love it. Starting with Buddy Holly, who lived in the village. And now my newest project, I just re-signed with Richard Goddard, who was producer of the first Bongos RCA record. Richard Goddard's record label is called Instant Records. And I've just signed with Richard. I got my first single out. It's called All Fall Down. And it's a duet with Daryl DMC McDaniels from Run DMC, who I always loved. And it's a statement song. It's a message song. Hopefully it inspires people to vote. And very uniquely, I believe, is coming out in 4 different genres. Like when we first started this conversation, we talked about how there are various genres and how they can mix. And they do. And this song is an example because the song itself is already a mixture of genres. It's kind of a folk, hip hop, rock song. But we're putting out, the main mix is already out on September 20th. Last Friday came out the folk mix, which is just acoustic guitar and vocal. And it's beautiful, very pure. And Daryl is one of the greatest rappers ever. So he's got so much personality in his voice and so much expression. The next version comes out this Friday, and it's an alternative country version. And following Friday will be the hip hop version.
Oh, okay, great. That's awesome. I've heard the first 2 and they're both really excellent. So I'm looking forward to the next 2 then.
Well, it's like a different flavors, but I think they're each unique and give you a different angle on the song, a different view of the song.
That's really great, though, that kind of bringing this whole conversation full circle, that it was initially all about you taking this multitude of genres that you were interested in and just playing around and experimenting with them in pretty vulnerable ways, right? Because you could just play by the numbers rock and roll or by the numbers punk rock music back in the Bongos time. But the fact that you were exploring and experimenting, like, how do we take that and that and that and that and turn it into this different thing is what all of this should always be about, because that's the fearless part of creativity, right?
Thank you. Yes. I try to instill that idea in my students. It's hard for them because we grew up in a world where everything is so segregated and so separate. I hate to use the word segregated because it has those social implications, but music is sometimes segregated, like genres are segregated.
Yeah.
And I think we should mix it up. I really feel that we can. Folk rock did that in the 60s. And, jazz fusion attempts to do that all the time. And there are ways to combine it in a natural way that isn't forced by just letting the music that you love come out.
Yeah. And that's where the sauce comes from. I mean, like you talked about the B-52s for a second, right? Like obviously there was punk components to that, but then like they sounded like that surfer sound from the late 50s, early 60s, and you're just like, how are they merging these two ideas
I
together? And
know.
that's where the good stuff comes from. It
I
was
agree with
totally
you.
crazy and it was beautiful.
I loved it. I love the B-52s. We're very much an important band and also a fun,
Oh yeah.
really fun band to see and to work with. I worked with Fred separately. I produced music for Fred in the 90s. Oh, he's just great to work with. And we've written many songs together, Fred and
Oh,
I. Yeah.
that's awesome, man. Collaboration. I mean, I think that that's what the joy of doing interviews like this is, because for me, I can only be outside looking in, having these conversations with myself about, oh, yeah, this band influenced this and this sound. But being able to talk to artists such as yourself and actually get that insight to who all has really worked with each other to get that insight or collaborate
Yeah.
is the joy of doing stuff like this. So that's really
I
great stuff.
understand. I understand. I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad you're doing this podcast.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. It's I mean, talk about vulnerability. It's a way for me to take this very highly personal project that I've been working on for myself for the last year or two and actually putting it in front of other people
Yeah.
because maybe somebody would learn something about it that they
Of
didn't know, just
course.
like me.
No, it's great. I love talking about the origins of my music and with the bongos. I mean, that was a magical period when that music was coming together that you're talking about, Drums Along the Hudson. A lot of it was that we were so young at the time. Like I said, we were just maybe turning 20 or so. But it was also a time when, music was evolved. It was always evolving. But there
Hmm.
was a time when we could also tap on things like electronics and just all kinds of things that were brand new. And there was a lot of excitement with that, like using new techniques and new devices in the studio to create an ambient sound or something. We really experimented. And when we were signed to RCA, that was another great experience because we had more of a budget to spend more time in the studio. So
Hmm.
instead of just having the weekend, even though with Drums on the Hudson, we did it on a weekend basically because that's all we had from the tour. We were on the road and we had 3 days off so we could make the album basically. That was that kind of a schedule. But
Hmm.
with RCA, we could go in from longer periods of time and think about how we orchestrate our music and how we could layer the harmonies to do just different things and sounds that we otherwise could not have done because it requires time. So those records were like the records we made for RCA were very much a learning experience and were an example of having more time to develop ideas.
That's good insight. I appreciate that because not being a person that's deeply in the music universe yet
Hmm.
myself, that kind of insight is actually helpful for me when I'm listening to certain albums, like a first album that sounds a little bit more raw, and then the second one
Yeah.
sounds very polished. And I just
Yes.
presume, oh, yeah, the producers were throwing more money at it. But in this case, that makes sense.
Yeah, sometimes it's that, and sometimes it's the artist wants to spend more time to get their ideas across. It's like making a movie, and when your budget, as you have more money to make like your next films or whatever, you spend more time so you can edit more carefully or come up with different types of effects or whatever. And we were learning. And as I said, I always had an interest in producing other artists as well. That time spent in the studio was my true education of being a producer too, because I could learn what the possibilities were. I'm producing a band right now, for instance. They're younger than my age at my first album, I think, or just about. I think they're 18 years old. So when we're in the studio, I just remember, number one, how it feels to be there for the first time like that, but
Mhm.
also the knowledge that I gained from being there, I try to use it for them. Even though now we're in an all digital format, still, I know what we can do with sound. And
Right.
now we get there quicker because we don't have to use several tape machines, or we don't have to rent outside gear. We can do it all with our computers. But it's still good to know what the possibilities are. And I learned those possibilities by being in the studio so much.
I mean,
Yeah.
that makes sense. That you're able to pay it forward and give that support and expertise like you were given when you were in England
Yeah.
making your record, that you felt that comfort and that support and that safety while you were making your record, and you can pay it forward to give that to other people. I mean, that's tremendous.
I love it. I'm fortunate on both ends of that by
Yeah.
being treated well and then by being able to help others sound good.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I think that's about it. Do you have any final thoughts before we close out the conversation for today?
I think we've covered a lot of great stuff, and I would just invite people to listen to my new single. I really am very proud of the way it came together. It's a culmination of a lot of ideas, and it was a thrill to finally get a chance to work with Daryl. And the
Hmm.
song is All Fall Down featuring Daryl DMC McDaniels, and it's on all the streaming services. And the video quite like the way the video came out. That was done by NYU students, and it's on YouTube, All Fall Down.
And it's on Spotify. Like I said, I've listened to
Oh,
it
yeah.
myself,
Yeah.
and it's the two versions that have come out so far are tremendous, and I'm excited for the next two. So
Thank
let's
you.
all
Thank
look
you.
out for them.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And people can always visit my website at richardbarone.com. Also on all the social media platforms. I'm easy
Absolutely.
to find out there,
Absolutely. We were able to connect with one another in order to make this happen. So I
Yeah.
very much appreciate your willingness to come and have this conversation today and have the discussion about this tremendous album that came out in 1982. And we're
Wow.
reappreciating it today, 40 years later. And
Incredible.
it's a total triumph. So,
Thank you so much.
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I do too. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Well, there you have it. Richard Barone from the Bongos discussing his experience making drums along the Hudson back from 1982. I just want to thank him so much for graciously taking the time to sit down with me and have this conversation about his experience and what he's been doing since then. I think it's just a great opportunity for us all to become better educated about the ins and outs of how all of this works, how all of these artists relate to each other, what was going through their mind when they were trying to take this inspiration that they had inside them and give it to other people. Like, what was the process and what was their experience before, during, and after? It's all really great stuff. It helps me better connect to this project and, in a way, through this podcast and this episode, through all of you. So I hope you really enjoyed the episode. It was a real joy for me to interview him. One thing I want to remind, as he said, is that you could always go check out what he's doing on his website, richardbarone.com. You could also go on to all of his social medias. As he said, he's quite accessible. I managed to connect with him on Instagram, and this is how this interview happened. So he definitely is accessible on social media, so check him out. Also, All Fall Down, the latest single that he put out, I would encourage you to go check those out. Also, if you're interested in the event that he plans to be putting on in mid-November around George Takei in Philadelphia, I'm sure it's on his website if you want to learn more about that. What I might encourage you to do is, now that you've heard what he has to say about his experience making drums along the Hudson, maybe go back and listen to the album or the few songs that I called out for my essential playlist and see if it changes a little bit for you based upon what you now understand about his experience making that record. I definitely didn't think about him being in England in the Ultravox studio making this. I did not ever imagine that that was how that was going to play out, but it did, and now it's going to probably change my interpretation a little bit, but that's the joy and the beauty of all of this. So please join us again. We'll probably get right back to the next year and keep moving forward here. I'm hopeful that along the way we'll get to have more special episodes like this where we have more artists who I'm highlighting come on and we do an interview and talk about their experience making that particular record and what they've been doing since. That would be a tremendous joy for me and a tremendous honor. So I hope it happens again. Please make sure that you join us again. Please make sure that you rate and comment. Please go connect with Richard Barone if you haven't done that already. Make sure to find him on Instagram. He's Richard Barone, pretty easy to find. And then us, Not Scary Just Music Pod. Make sure that you subscribe so that you can not only check up on every episode that we drop every Tuesday about each year in the project, but then also for any of these special episodes that happen to pop up. Make sure that you tell your co-conspirators, your collaborators, your bandmates, whomever, because much like doing this project, this interview was not scary. It was just a conversation between two excited people talking about the thing that they love. So let's all connect to it because it's not scary. None of it is. It's just music. Thanks for listening.